Our first guest is one of the finest political reporters in the country today. Maggie Haberman covers the White House for the New York Times. Her latest book, Confidence Man, details the making of President Trump and is no doubt set to become one of the most defining books on his presidency to date. She's joining us remotely from New York, and here to join her in conversation is Ben Smith, Semafor's co-founder and editor-in-chief. Ben, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much for joining us, and thanks to our partners at Gallup for having us. Long time no see, Maggie. I last saw Maggie last night at a dinner in New York where all of the most important people in town were hanging on her every word, although, of course, this is Washington, so everyone here is more important. And Maggie, I guess, yes, and the book is fabulous, and we're thrilled to have you.
Thanks for having me. Thank you.
And I figured I'd just start with today's news, because one of the many reasons you should read Maggie's book is that much of it, the first half, I guess, is really about Donald Trump's life in New York in the 70s and 80s and 90s. And one of the recurring themes is state and local and federal investigations of Donald Trump in which he plays and repeatedly wins games of chicken with prosecutors. And today the Department of Justice announced that they're appointing a special counsel to decide whether or not to indict him. I'm curious how you see that in light of what you learned researching this book.
Sure. So first of all, again, thanks for having me, and thanks for having me on a computer as opposed to in person. I apologize for not being there. This seemed like yet another in a series of decades-long interactions, often involving gamesmanship by Trump with prosecutors or elected officials who are looking into him in some way. And it's interesting, Jack Smith, the special counsel who was named, has a very long history with investigations. That included having worked in the Brooklyn district, the Eastern District of New York, where, as a federal prosecutor, where Trump was investigated nearly 50 years ago on a possible fraud charge in relation to a real estate transaction. So it's just sort of amazing how everything kind of comes back to the same place as with Trump. Trump is telling people he's not happy about this special counsel because, he has flashbacks to the Mueller investigation and how that dominated his presidency. He believes this will make things take longer. It's hard to imagine it shortens them. I don't think he has some special insight into this, but it is yet another, you could see a world then where this just drags things out for months and months and months and months and doesn't end in a prosecution and just sort of fades into the background. And the history of Donald Trump in New York is cultivating prosecutors, befriending prosecutors. When Mueller was appointed, he wanted literally to walk across the street and go talk to Mueller. He's not going to be able to do that here, and it's far different, to have a special counsel when he's not president this time. But it is just another recurring pattern in Donald Trump's life.
Yeah, do you think, in New York, really the pattern was him doing stuff that would have gotten other people indicted and not getting indicted? Is there some trick that he's going to be able to apply in this case?
I think there's probably actually a whole group of people in New York who were engaged in certain activities and didn't get investigated over time.
All of our sources over many years, yes.
No comment on that, but that's because this is, it is a world where, the Manhattan District Attorney of many years, Robert Morgenthau, was, part of the elite power structure. And, I don't know that he ever was given anything to investigate specifically to Donald Trump. I know of, people who claim to have been stiffed by Donald Trump, contractors, which there were many over the years, made some complaints to Morgenthau's office, and the office's feeling was we're not a collection agency. There, however, was always a whiff of corruption around Trump and allegations of mob ties and so forth. And so there were things to look into, and no one did. I don't know whether this ends up being yet another series of investigations that go nowhere. We're going to find out.
And I think I'd like to sort of stay in New York in the 80s for a minute here, because I think that one of the really interesting things about this book is the effort that I think is sort of out of fashion in journalism to really understand the person you're writing about, not treat them as a two-dimensional cable news figure, but really kind of get to their psychological motivations and what makes them tick. And one of the things, so much has been written about this book. Many of you have probably read the book. One of my colleagues did not realize you were remote and brought it to be autographed. Sorry,
oh, no.
Sorry, Kadia. But But one of the themes that I really struck me is Trump's interaction with women through the years. And like there's this scene that I'm not going to read in full because, this is a family event. But it's a fundraiser in the late 80s, and when the conversation somehow turned to Brazilian women. And he says something like totally shocking at the table with a bunch of fancy people and his wife. And I guess I wonder if you could just sort of take what you learned and put it in context, or really on that theme.
Sure. So I would say that there is the clear through line of his relationships with women and interactions with women that fall in the same broad category of every other relationship he has, which is that he needs to, dominate in some way or another. In the instance you're describing, which was a charity event where he and his then wife Ivana were attending, and his employee Tony Glideman had brought his wife, and Trump says something just incredibly crude to Glideman's wife, who just reacted with sort of shock. And part of why he says certain things is to shock. He's constantly sort of speaking in a very crude manner about sex, or about things of a sexual nature, but some of it is, appears to be about dominance. At the same time, one of the things that was striking about him when he was an executive in New York was that he did have a surprisingly what you would consider progressive record of having women executives around, in various roles. And, as one person who worked for him said to me, no one else in New York was really at high levels was doing that at that time, other than sort of as tokens. So it's everything with him is that, for every example, there's a counterexample. He has a very long history of saying extremely crude and overt things to women. He's obviously been accused of a rape. He has been accused of sexual harassment over and over again. He's been accused of sexual misconduct. And he spent, years proudly sitting on Howard Stern's couch saying all kinds of things about women who he was dating, including his now wife. Which gets to the point, I guess, Ben, that when 2016 came around, probably no one should have been that surprised by the Access Hollywood tape, because it was in keeping with the pattern.
Right, Howard Stern viewers were not, or listeners were not as surprised.
We're not.
Let me ask you. I'm a media reporter, so let me ask you about writing a book. And we actually have some data that I was thinking about from our partners at Gallup and the Knight Foundation here, really about people's engagement with pay. If you could, Sydney, put up that data. It's sort of people's relationship with news and with paying for news, and this, basically. It shows the challenges of those of us who are in the paywall business, and really kind of the limits of people's willingness to pay, which obviously is very important, in the long form news. But it occurs to me, of course, a book is like the ultimate paywall. Like you gotta show up at a store and hand over money. And I am curious, because you've really been in this whole spectrum of you've published a book, you've written for the New York Times, which is a paywall publication. You're out on the open internet at Politico and on Twitter, where you're exposed to all of the craziest things in the world at all times. And I am curious if the sort of your approach to journalism and the way you think about your audience changes in a way based on how much the commitment that comes with, okay, I'm going to buy your book, okay, I'm paying for a New York Times subscription, versus I'm just here to yell at you for free on Twitter. Do you think, how does that sort of affect, and I guess particularly with the book?
You mean, I don't consider myself there to yell at people for free on Twitter. I actually generally just put stuff out if it's informative, or at least that's my goal. No, I don't think it's different. I actually think of these things all as of a piece, as part of journalism. I do think there's an expectation, because of the early stages of the internet, the early years of the internet, when a lot of news content was free, and certainly Twitter is free. I think there is an expectation from segments of the readership that news should be free, and in an ideal world, information would all be free, but we don't live in that world, and there is a world where producing quality journalism costs money. I see books as part of that. Books are journalism, but the way I approach it doesn't change depending on what the audience is. I can do a sort of joking around tweet in a way that I can't do in a newspaper. But I can also, do analysis in a book that I can't necessarily do in the pages of the Times, or that I wouldn't do on Twitter, because there's no room for nuance there.
What's, as somebody who had to like kind of step out of this just all-encompassing news cycle to step back and step way back in time to write this book, what surprised you most about kind of where you found yourself at the end, about about the process, about stepping back?
So I think the thing that was stepping back was hard for me just as a process. It was in general hard because I'm so hardwired to the daily news cycle. So that was getting myself out of it was difficult and took some time and took a level of discipline that I'm not sure I ever entirely achieved, but tried to have, and with varying degrees of success. In terms of what I was looking for in the arc of this book and sort of what the step back was to try to show the world that Trump came from and how much of that world and sort of what, and who he is that he exported to Washington, and how much that trickled down to the Republican Party. What I found as I was stepping back and going, doing a lot of interviews and reading Wayne Barrett's, who was the progenitor of all Trump coverage, basically, wrote the first real Trump biography, and was, I would say, unique in the sense that, he didn't treat Trump as if he was, a Kennedy, and he didn't treat Trump as if he was a joke. He actually treated him as if he was a serious power player in New York City, which at times he was, until he had his collapse in 1990, 1991, and then he, spent the next decade trying to write the tale of a comeback. But the thing that I was struck by was just the rigid consistency of this guy over many, many, many decades. The Donald Trump that you see now is the same person that you saw in the late 1970s. Whatever growth is taking place is at a level that we are not seeing. Literally telling us, a story to me in an interview at Mar-a-Lago in March of 2021 that was almost identical to a story he told Lois Romano in 1984 for a piece she did for the Style section. The complaints are all the same. The victimization is all the same. I was very struck the other night in his announcement in Florida when he said, "I'm a victim." And I was surprised that he actually said it that way. I think a lot of members of his party wished he hadn't said it. But he had and he gave an interview to the Washington Times in the 1990s when he was in the middle of his attempted comeback, and he said, "I see myself," I'm paraphrasing, but "I see myself as a very honest person in a very corrupt world." And, that is sort of the worldview. So that's what I was trying to show.
Yeah, gosh, it sounds like, you're talking about sort of writing a biography without what's sort of like typically considered the basic ingredient, which is like a character arc.
There's the arc is sort of flat, but the arc, such as it is a changing world that eventually sort of meets him where he is in terms of how he approaches life, as opposed to how it had been approached for a long time.
Yeah, that kind of brings me to a question about particularly about the contemporary Republican Party and contemporary American politics, which you hear debated constantly, which is, was Donald Trump an anomaly who hijacked the Republican Party, took it in a new direction, but that ultimately, when he's gone, Trumpism is gone, everything that he was a totally singular figure, versus was he the totally logical outgrowth of, a decade of partisanship and culture? And I guess I'm curious, maybe it's phrased always as this kind of binary debate, but I'm curious where you come out on that.
Yeah, I don't think it's a binary. I think that these things are not mutually exclusive, and I think two things can be true at once and are. I think that Trump is a singular figure only because there is no other figure who had been part of the pop culture fabric for so many decades and with whom so many voters identified from having seen him on TV over many, many years. I write in the book about how, I was interviewing caucus goers in Iowa in January of 2016, shortly before the caucuses, and asking a pretty leading question at one of his rallies, which was basically, "Are you here because the spectacle is ending?" And they kept telling me they were caucusing for him, including one man who looked at me like I had 8 heads and said I watched him run his business. And he meant The Apprentice. And so I don't think it was clear, particularly to sort of the more insular New York, D.C. Media world that in 2016, just how formed opinions were of Trump based on The Art of the Deal and then based on The Apprentice, which really was based on The Art of the Deal. But I don't think there's another figure who would have had universal name recognition and was seen as this, titan of riches, regardless of what Trump's actual financial circumstances are. That was the perception. But that said, I don't think the party would have elected a Trump had there not been the Tea Party and the reaction to the fiscal crisis and to Obama's election in 2008. And, I think Trump seized on that. He didn't create it, but he seized on it and he fueled it and benefited from that fuel. And there was this enormous era of mistrust that began to occur in our politics, honestly, beginning late 1990s, but all the way through the fiscal crisis, that Trump was perfectly suited for. And so I think both things are true.
One of the questions that, I think everybody who's written a book about the last our recent history has been asked, is how did you think about, you had a piece of hot news, I think sometimes interpreted on social media as the final silver bullet that would change everything, but at least a pretty good story. And you had to wait for the publication of a book, and we all had to wait for the publication of a book. And how did you sort of balance your responsibility to the book, your responsibility to the Times, your inability to sit on a piece of news characterologically? How did you kind of approach that? So
I was in touch with my editors throughout the process, and my editors of the newspaper, throughout the process of writing the book, and I shared considerable...
We're not allowed to name the newspaper since I left, but...
A newspaper. It is the only one. I shared considerable information with them throughout the process. I turned to this project in earnest, Ben, after the second impeachment trial ended in February of 2021, and I kept thinking that I was going to get time to work on this book. I actually had planned to really start working on it during the transition, but then that couldn't happen because he, wouldn't leave, and he was holding these meetings in the Oval Office, which was a story that I broke in real time, and so forth and so on. My goal is always to get confirmed, reportable information in print as soon as possible, but the process of a book is different, and a lot of this stuff took time to confirm. So, and much of it, in addition to sharing with my editors, we put out in the paper well before the publication. You came up with the New York Post, which last week published sort of a bar at the bottom of the page that said, "Florida man makes announcement," page 26, and had a 300-word mocking blurb on page 26. A post-staff report.
Right, post-staff report. Think that's getting to him? Do you think that bothers him?
I do, but I also think that the Post and Donald Trump have been in some kind of a dance for 40 years, and I don't think this is the end of it. Actually, I guess just over 30. I don't think this is the end of it. No, 40 years. I think that this does bother him. I think that Rupert Murdoch knows better than anybody that to not say Donald Trump's name is the biggest insult you can give him, and I have an anecdote to that effect at the beginning of the book. But that said, will this hold if he's the nominee? I think that's the big question. And
I guess, the 2 minutes remaining I figure I've got to ask you, he did in fact announce, the coverage broadly mirrored the Post. He got kind of a shrug. The event was kind of rambling and honestly kind of boring. What's going on? Is he just going to fizzle out? Does he really want to do this?
I don't think his heart is quite in this. It might get in it again. I think it's actually pretty telling that the way he has to get attention is to give a teleprompter speech. And that sort of speaks about where we're at. In 2020, he did a rally, and in 2016, he came down the escalator at Trump Tower and ripped up his speech. Look, I think he wants to be president again. I don't know that he wants to campaign again. I also would not predict that he's going to fizzle out. I think that the lesson of the book you're holding in your hand is obituary gets political and otherwise gets written prematurely over and over again. I do think something feels a little different this time, but we'll see.
And what about you? You just published, look at the page, 500...
8,000 pages.
An 8,000-page biography, first volume, of Donald Trump. Are you gonna get back? Are you gonna leap back on the Trump train? Will we be seeing you at Mar-a-Lago?
I expect I will be involved in coverage, but it will not look like it did for the last 6 years, 7 years, 8 years. Yeah.
What's it gonna look like?
Don't know. Stay tuned.
And do you, and genuinely, do you anticipate a volume 2?
It's a good question. I don't. But ask me again in 2 years. My current plan is that this is my Trump book, and that's that.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Maggie.
Thanks for having me.